Rain, Rain by Anne Martin. Chapter 27. My story is such a sad one. On Monday, 10 days after Hurricane Susan, my school reopens. Halloween has come and gone, but I don't think anyone noticed. Uncle Weldon arrives at my house at the usual time. I'm waiting for him on the front porch, only now I'm alone. This is because my father let Rain outside without her collar during a superstorm. The air is cool and the morning is sunny. As soon as I see my uncle's truck, I run across our yard to the temporary bridge and walk very carefully along the planks. I don't want to fall into the stream below, even though now there isn't much water down there. Parked in the road in front of our house is an old yellow car my father borrowed from Sam Diamond. He has to leave it in the street since we can't drive over our temporary bridge, but at least we aren't stuck on our property anymore. I climb into Uncle Weldon's truck, and as soon as I've closed the door, I announce, "Praise, praise, and praise." Uncle Weldon smiles at me. "Excellent. Was there room for that on your list?" "Yes," I say, "there was room." "Any word from any of the shelters?" I shake my head. "No, no word." "Are you nervous about going back to school?" I think for a moment. Yes, I am nervous. My father drove me by my school yesterday so I could see it, and it looked fine, but I'm still nervous. "What are you nervous about?" I shake my head. I don't know. Mrs. Liebler walks me to Mrs. Cushell's room, and I see my desk. It looks like it did before Hurricane Susan. So does the rest of the room. Mrs. Liebler sits in her chair, I sit in mine. I begin to feel calmer. The bell rings and Mrs. Cushell stands at the front of the room and smiles at us. "Hello, class," she says. "I'm glad to see you here, and I'm glad to be here with you. The last week or so has been pretty scary, but now it's time to get back to work. Before we do that, though, I think some of you might want to talk about your experiences during the storm." I can't help myself. I leap out of the chair and say, "We can't start yet, Mrs. Cushell. Anders and Lenora aren't here." Mrs. Liebler pulls me back into my seat and gives me a look that is most likely a warning look. "I was just getting to that, Rose," says Mrs. Cushell. "I'm sorry to say that Anders and Lenora won't be in our class any longer. Their families had to move." Flo raises her hand and says their house is washed away. "Are they okay?" asks Parvani. Her voice shakes a little. "I mean, are Anders and Lenora okay?" "They're fine," Mrs. Cushell replies. "Promise. Their families have left to live with relatives." "Could we write to them?" asks Parvani. "That's a wonderful idea," says Mrs. Cushell. "We'll write letters to Anders and Lenora this afternoon." Now, who would like to talk about their experiences? One by one, my classmates talk about the last week and a half. "My sister broke her arm," says Morgan. "She fell down our stairs when the lights were out." "I wanted to go trick-or-treating," says Martin, "but my parents said Halloween was canceled." "We have to live on the second floor of our house until all the mud gets cleaned out of the first floor," says Flo. "Our house stinks." Mrs. Cushell turns to me. "Rose, would you like to tell us anything? How did Hurricane Susan affect you?" "Two trees fell in our yard, a birch and an elm. An oak tree split in half, and the elm tree snapped over. Our bridge washed out, and my father let Rain outside during the storm without her collar, and she didn't come back." Parvani gasps. She cranes her neck to look at me and says, "Rain is missing?" Her voice is small. "Yes," I reply. "She's been gone since the storm?" asks Josh. I see Mrs. Cushell and Mrs. Liebler glance at each other. Mrs. Cushell raises her eyebrows and Mrs. Liebler shrugs her shoulders. It is some kind of conversation. "That is such a sad story," Morgan exclaims. "Yes, it is," I say. Then I add, "I devised a search plan." I tell my classmates about the map and the articles and the lists. Also, my uncle put an ad in the paper. "I liked it when Rain came to school," says Josh. "She's the best dog ever," adds Flo. "Rose, I hope you find Rain," says Parvani. Now her voice is trembling. She looks at me for so long that I have to turn my eyes away. Mrs. Cushell touches Parvani's shoulders. "What would you like to share?" she asks gently. Parvani begins to cry. "My mom is an artist," she tells us. "She stored her paintings in a warehouse, and the warehouse flooded, and she lost all her work. everything she painted for 15 years. I stare at Parvani. I didn't know her mother was an artist. This is very sad. Tears make wet tracks down Parvani's cheeks. The room grows quiet. Parvani, says Mrs. Kushel. She kneels beside her. Parvani gulps air. Do you need to step into the hall? I ask her. Rose, Mrs. Liebler starts to say, but Parvani gets to her feet. Yes, she replies. Gulping and sobbing and wiping her face with her sleeve, Parvani winds her way through the desks to the door. I'll go with her, I tell Mrs. Liebler, and I follow Parvani into the hall. Parvani leans her forehead against the wall. I realize I should say something that will comfort her. Parvani, I thought of a new homonym this morning. A triple. Praise, praise, and praise. Isn't that good? Parvani sniffles and nods her head. Thank you, Rose.